Hi folks, I hope you all are doing well, and I hope you had access to the previous videos and readings I've posted on Blackboard. Today we're going to continue with looking at interpersonal violence, and we're going to focus particularly on youth. So we'll look at bullying, we'll look at youth violence, and we'll look at child mistreatment as well. So let's get started. So first, let's just look at bullying and youth violence. So youth violence entails children and young adults between the ages of 10 to 29. So that is most, if not all of you and me. It peaks during late adolescence or early adulthood. Criminology generally supports this. There's a theory in criminology known as the life course theory, and if you've learned about it before, forgive me for repeating it. But the life course theory generally follows our criminal trajectories from, when we were young to when we're very old or dead. And proponents of the theory find that criminality peaks right around your late teens. So, if you were to draw a line as to kind of track the criminality of somebody, let me just get my pen here. It would kind of start really low. I'll go over here. Really low, and then you get to your teens and it goes up. Maybe stays there for a little bit, and then as you get to your mid-20s, it kind of goes back down and it stays there. That's supposedly the average sort of criminal trajectory. So violence, criminality, all of that stuff, your likelihood of, partaking in a crime peaks at, your late teens. For some people, that's not always the case. So for some people, their peak offending maybe never slows down. So I'm following the purple line here, and it just kind of keeps going. Now, those are very few people. We call them the chronic 6% because studies show it's less than 10% of people actually, have that sort of purple trajectory. They most follow the red trajectory. And it also talks about kind of why people stop committing crime as well, but we won't get into that today. So just know that, youth violence, it peaks during late adolescence or late adulthood, and this has been supported by criminological theories in the past. Youth violence is an umbrella term, so it covers sort of a range of behaviors. It covers homicide and assault between youths, fighting. It covers bullying and or other forms of emotional abuse. It covers dating violence, and it covers other things as well. This is not by any means an exhaustive list, but these are just some of the things that when we talk about youth violence, we talk about these sorts of violent acts between youth. The World Health Organization notes that youth violence is the 4th leading cause of death among youth worldwide, after AIDS, road accidents, and forgive me, but I can't remember the 3rd. But it is the 4th leading cause of death worldwide, with roughly 200,000 deaths per year among youth ages 10 to 29. 83% of those victims are male. So boys and young men are more likely to be both perpetrators and victims of youth violence. One particular form of youth violence is bullying, and this is what I'll focus on more than other types of youth violence today and in this class. So bullying is repetitive. Hold on a second. My tech is being weird, excuse me. All right, it's intentional, it's aggressive, and it's between individuals and groups with a power differential. So bullying is not a 1 or 2 time thing. It isn't accidental. Bullying shifts power. So the bully or bullies want to take power from their targets or from their victims. Their behavior is meant to control somebody or dominate somebody or belittle somebody. Now, bullying and other forms of youth violence, but particularly bullying because it does involve that power differential, is really supported by acts or beliefs at the lower levels of the violence pyramid. So if you remember the violence pyramid that we've been talking about throughout the class, we look at, attitudes and belief and implicit biases, we look at microaggressions, we look at discrimination, and then we look at violent acts. And, bullying is done because of perceived differences, essentially. Like, nobody's bullying somebody because they have the same hair color or something. It's usually because there's some sort of perceived difference, and that perceived difference is bad because we've been taught that that difference is bad. The graph here on this slide is just a look at bullying among different genders from 2005 to 2013, and studies have noted that bullying has been going down since 2005, so that is something to be pleased about, but it's still at a fair level. Bullying can involve name calling, it can involve physical assault, it can involve active ignoring or exclusion, and it can also involve spreading rumors. So the first two, name calling and physical assault, are what we traditionally think of as bullying. When we think of bullying, we think of, somebody name calling somebody else, teasing them, calling them, horrific names, but also, shoving them, punching them, physically hurting them in some way. Active ignoring and exclusion and spreading rumors are what some call relational bullying, and so that's not necessarily physical bullying, it's looking at the relationships between people. School is the most common site of bullying. It's where it commonly occurs because that's where you're going to get groups of kids in one spot. Common targets of bullying, so not necessarily common, people, but just things that people are more likely to bully about, include physical appearance, so how you dress, what your hair looks like, maybe if you have a different skin tone, things of that nature, and sexual orientation. So if, you don't act like a boy, or you don't act like a boy, or you don't act like a girl, which is more under gender orientation as well. But if you're, caught kissing boys and you're a boy or things like that, that's a target of bullying. Boys and girls do bully differently, according to research. So boys tend to bully in more quote-unquote physical ways. So they do the name calling, they do the physical assaults, the more sort of aggressive acts, while girls tend to bully more in relational ways. So the social exclusion, the ignoring, the spreading rumors. Now that's not always the case. It's not that boys always are physical and girls are always relational, but studies have seen that's largely where things are. Boys also bully more outside of their core group of friends. So they'll bully somebody who they perceive as the class weirdo or something, and they're not going to be friends with that person. Girls, on the other hand, might be more likely to bully within their social network. So, they'll be quote-unquote frenemies, where they're friends to their face, but then that targeted girl will be bullied behind her back for something. Some risk factors for youth violence as a whole at the individual level include behavioral disorders. So if you have like ADHD or other sorts of behavioral disorders, you might be more of a bully. Early involvement with alcohol or drugs, and this is kind of a common theme for violence in general at the interpersonal level, is that involvement with substances is a risk factor for violence. Now, substance use is not a cause of violence, so you can't blame your violent actions on substance use. That isn't an excuse, but if you are a substance abuser, you are at an increased risk for being violent in any sort of interpersonal form. You are also more at risk of becoming a bully if you're exposed to violence in your family and among peers, because this socializes you to believe that violence is okay. So you're brought up with those sort of biases and attitudes and beliefs, going back to that violence pyramid. And the interpersonal level, so between individuals, having low parental involvement. So if your parents mistreat you, or even if they're just really not involved in your life, you might be more of a bully. Low family income, parental substance use or criminality. Again, we're seeing that substance use. At the community level, the access to and misuse of substances and firearms is led to an increased risk of bullying, income inequality, and poverty. And the quality of governance. And so by governance, I basically mean what's the quality of laws and policies and their enforcement in the community. So what are laws like around bullying or around abuse? How are police handling that? Are there good relationships between police and the community so that, kids who are being bullied or kids who are bullying can feel comfortable talking to somebody about it? And if there is a poor quality in neighborhoods, then bullying and other forms of abuse are more likely to be kind of left unchecked. So some consequences of youth violence for victims and communities. Some consequences include poor mental well-being, so anxiety, depression, behavioral disorders, poor school performance, so lower grades, missed school days, truancy, things of that nature. Physiological concerns. One study has shown that among adults who were bullied as children, they had higher inflammation rates, and loss of social cohesion. So if you've got, kids who are terrorizing their neighbor kids, the parents then, assuming the parents are, actively involved in their children's lives, might not feel comfortable getting together with those other neighbors with that child. So the cohesion of the neighborhood is disrupted in that sense. For offenders, there are also consequences. So schools and parents and neighborhoods and societies, etc., kind of have a range of choices when it comes to stopping a kid from bullying. Some of them are more social programs. Some of them might be more psychological, such as therapy or, talking things out or having restorative justice type interventions. But because the United States is a very punitive country, we like to punish people instead of, rehabilitating them. More often what happens, especially in poor Black or brown communities, is that these kids are labeled as offenders, they're labeled as thugs, they're labeled as dangerous, and they get inappropriate intervention. They're sent from school to detention or school to juvenile prison facilities, which then kind of funnels them into adult criminality in the future. This is known as the school to prison pipeline. I've put a couple of videos up on the YouTube playlist that I really encourage you to watch, because the school to prison pipeline is something that criminologists are sort of uncovering now within, really relatively recent times, and it's a big deal. Some argue that this school to prison pipeline is another way to police Black and brown communities. And I remember mentioning in the first day of class or the first week of class that violence is often served to oppress those in marginalized groups, to uphold these ideas of white supremacy. So by treating childhood bullies as these quote-unquote violent offenders is also sort of acting in a violent manner by taking away their agency to, change, because more often than not, these childhood bullies aren't necessarily going to be awful adults. They just need, to be talked to. They're being abused at home, so they need to understand kind of the consequences of all of that. They're not sociopaths, but we're treating them as if they are, and so labeling them and putting them in jail, which then turns them into people who could be dangerous. So all of this in a nutshell. Bullying isn't good. Kids shouldn't bully, but the way we treat bullies, especially bullies from quote unquote other communities, Black communities, brown communities, poor communities, is too punitive, and it's too ineffective, according to many researchers. On the flip side, we've got children who are victims of violence from the hands of adults, so child maltreatment. So youth violence really looks at violence kind of between children and among children, or among youth, I guess. And child maltreatment looks at children suffering at the hands of adults, particularly caretakers. So Child maltreatment involves the abuse or neglect of a child under the age of 18 by either a parent or a caretaker or somebody in a custodial role, whoever is supposed to be taking care of and providing for these children. Child maltreatment includes neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional and mental abuse, other forms of abuse. It is responsible for over 1,600 deaths per year in the United States, according to the CDC, and 41,000 deaths worldwide per year, according to the World Health Organization. In 2012, roughly 700,000 children were found by Child Protective Services to be victims of maltreatment. Now, this is just the ones that are reported. So, if they're misclassified as not abusive or not maltreatment, they're not going to go reported. Or if they're never even reported to law enforcement, then they're not going to be included in this number. So there's a good chance that these rates of death and these rates of maltreatment that are not fatal are higher, but we don't know. It's kind of this dark figure. Roughly 25% of adults report being physically abused as children. In addition, 1 in 5 adult women and 1 in 13 adult men report being sexually abused as children as well. Refugee girls are especially vulnerable to sexual abuse and exploitation. Again, these violent acts are a way to uphold systems of power, and refugee girls, often coming from poor third world Black and brown countries, are being victimized as a way to uphold white supremacy or patriarchy or other systems of power. They're more likely to be sold into trafficking or to be exploited or to just be abused. This isn't to say that other children are not at risk of being abused or that whatever happens to them is not horrendous, but it is of note, especially now that we have a number of refugees kind of migrating among countries. Some risk factors for being abused. So if you're a child who is under the age of 4 or an adolescent, you're more likely to be abused or maltreated. Children who are disabled or physically quote-unquote abnormal or outwardly emotional, so they cry a lot, they show outward displays of emotion, are more likely to be mistreated. Again, going back to this idea of violence as a way to separate us from them. So disabled kids aren't quote-unquote normal, so they're an other. So we have to be violent against them to kind of keep them from trying to become normal. At the caregiver level of things, caregivers who mistreat children are more likely to have a history of abuse themselves. So it's a cycle of violence. Looking again at substance misuse and abuse, so they're more likely to have abused substances. They're more likely to have been involved in criminal activity outside of child abuse. At the community and society level, and this is going to be a repeat of risk factors among all levels of violence, inequality spurns violence at all levels. So gender inequality, social inequality, income inequality, inadequate resources, inadequate policies, and social norms that encourage dominance. So if you have these biases, whether implicit or explicit, that encourage that men are the head of the household, children listen to parents, parents are okay to discipline children how they want to, then you're going to support those violent acts, because violence is just a way of enforcing the norms that are in power. Some consequences of child maltreatment are that as adults, maltreated children are at increased risk for poor mental well-being. So again, depression, anxiety, other behavioral disorders, smoking, obesity, and eating disorders. High-risk sexual behaviors such as having sex without condoms, with strange partners, with multiple partners. STI likelihoods are increased in there as well. And unintended pregnancy, as well as substance misuse. I know, it's repeated, we keep seeing it. At the interpersonal level, substances play a big role. So, short video today, not a lot. If you have questions, again, feel free to email me. Next session, we'll look at interpersonal violence in ignored populations, so the elderly and disabled. Be sure to check out the YouTube playlist for more videos. Be sure to check out the readings. Be sure to check out the class activity, which relates to cyberbullying and the First Lady. So I'm sure it'll be interesting, and I can't wait to see what you guys have to say. Thank you for listening.